What's up, guys? Michael here to talk about Jordan Peterson. While there is much that could be said about this increasingly teary-eyed man, I have one purpose and one purpose only: to check out some of Peterson's lectures where he talks about postmodern philosophy. In particular, I want to see if I can figure out why he thinks that postmodern philosophy, as embodied by French philosophers like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, is one of the most imminent threats to contemporary human culture. Sounds scary, I know. But before we get into it, a few notes to help guide us on our journey. And if you're really antsy, just skip forward a minute and I'll start watching clips. First, I'm only going to watch clips where Peterson is talking about philosophy and philosophers. This guy says a lot of stuff, and lots of people on YouTube have made videos saying stuff about the stuff he says, so check those out if you want, but today I'm staying in my lane. Second, he talks a lot about postmodernism, which is a super broad category used to describe everything from architecture to visual art to beer. But thankfully, he makes it clear that he's referring to a certain strand of post-war French philosophy, usually referred to as post-structuralism or deconstruction, embodied in the work of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. And while Peterson makes them sound like active threats to the safety of your family, Foucault's been dead since 1984. Derrida went to be with baby Jesus in 2004. So they're not going to get you. Now, I'll talk about it more once we get going, but the important thing to know is that both Derrida and Foucault took a critical approach to the history of Western philosophy, and for Foucault, Western civilization more generally. And to different extents, both were interested in looking at the way in which Platonic idealism, i.e. the philosophy of Plato, and Christian metaphysics led to a hierarchical tendency in philosophy, which basically means one in which truth is a vertical journey from the stuff we see in front of us to the actual truth that exists at some higher plane, whether it's a realm of perfect forms for Plato or, for Christian theology, God's house of great ideas. And building on this, they were both interested in how idealist and Christian logic were used to make absolute claims on things like truth and power by both thinkers and political actors. Third, as we'll see, Peterson describes lots of very dangerous ideas and cultural trends to the work of these philosophers. And spoiler alert, but I think at best he's just off, and at worst, he seems to have genuinely not read these guys. So you might be asking, why even spend your time on this? Well, for one, people listen to Peterson, and it's important that folks know when he's wrong about big ideas. And more importantly, I think it's important to ask, why would he vilify a couple of dead French philosophers? Now, after watching 20 or so hours of his lectures on the topic, I'm honestly not totally sure. And, I'm hesitant to speculate about his inner intentions. But his anger towards these philosophers and their ideas seem to come from him feeling as if they are calling his subject identity and position into question. Put a little differently, it seems like the work of Foucault and Derrida, when properly understood, might call some of Peterson's own assumptions about truth, culture, and society into question, which is, the point of philosophy. Finally, Peterson jumps around a lot in his lectures, so it's hard to not cover lots of ground when trying to get to the bottom of these critiques he has of philosophy. So if there's anything that doesn't quite make sense, or if you guys have more questions or comments, please drop them in the comments right here, and I'll try my best to get back to you. So let's get into it in this Philosopher Reacts to Jordan Peterson on postmodernism. But before we get into it, I want to tell you about this video sponsor, Fabulous, the #1 self-care app to help you build better habits and achieve your goals. If you have difficulty sticking to new routines, and I know that I do, or if you'd like to improve your happiness on a daily basis, which I do as well, Fabulous can be an excellent solution. It's a digital coach that uses behavioral science to help you create and stick to fresh new habits. With Fabulous, you can adopt a personalized daily routine that can help you tackle goals of any size. If you want to decrease stress, increase productivity, or even drink more water every day, Fabulous can help. The app helps you create rituals throughout the day, starting from the moment you wake up. These small steps help you ease into new habits and could lead to long-lasting changes. Fabulous offers 2 programs to choose from: dedicated programs or habit tracking. With the dedicated programs, you're immersed in a multi-week journey of guided self-discovery. Fabulous will send you inspiring and motivational letters, and at the end of each one, you'll choose a positive action for that week. These new positive actions are added to your daily routine, and the app sends friendly reminders to help you stick to them. If you opt for the habit tracking approach, you can go at your own pace as you complete bite-sized tasks and get gentle encouragement throughout the day. You can choose from 100 tasks within the app or add your own. And with the Fabulous Premium account, you can track an unlimited number of habits and access all the programs and exercises the app has to offer, like coaching sessions and support circles. Join the community of more than 30 million users around the world and start building your ideal daily routine. The first 100 people who click on the link in the description will get 25% off their Fabulous subscription. So check it out today. And now, back to the show. Okay, here's a video where Peterson talks about postmodernism and cultural Marxism from what looks like a very lovely cabin, by the way. So let's start that.
There's a postmodern philosophy, which we'll talk about a bit, that really came into its vogue in the 1970s after classic Marxism, especially of the economic type, had been so thoroughly discredited that no one but an absolute reprobate could support it publicly anymore. Even the French intellectuals had to admit that communism was a bad deal by the end of the 1960s.
Okay, so that right there, it's worth noting when he says that anyone who could support Marxism was a reprobate and the French intellectuals didn't. I mean, that's just historically wrong. So Louis Althusser was a super influential professor in Paris, was around at the time of someone like Jacques Derrida, and was a Marxist, wrote a lot of books on Marx. And a lot of his students, people like Etienne Balibar, Jacques Rancière, Alain Badiou, all who are still working, are all, to various extents, Marxist philosophers who were all studying, teaching, writing, speaking in France, in Paris in the 60s and 70s, none of whom were shy about their engagement with the Marxist tradition. So that's just kind of not true.
Even the French intellectuals like Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous philosopher, had to admit by the end of the 1960s that the Stalinist, communist, Maoist experiment and all of its variants, not just those particular dictators, but all of its variants, was an absolute catastrophic failure.
Okay, so he says something about Sartre here, which is both true and not true. Sartre absolutely was critical of some of the violent political catastrophes that took place under the name of communism in Europe. At the same time, this did not lead to a disavowal of Marxism. You know, starting with Sartre's work, Search for a Method, he said a huge part of his project was trying to find a sort of philosophical synthesis in existentialism and Marxism. He does that up through his work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, and it remains an interest of his. So I think that Peterson right here is confusing, you know, philosophers being critical of existing political events with those philosophers then disavowing the writings of Karl Marx, which are two different things. Okay, jumping ahead a little bit, Peterson is still talking about his sort of like intellectual history of what postmodernism is.
They started to pit the oppressed against the oppressor, and that opened up the avenue to identifying any number of groups as oppressed and oppressor, and to continue the same narrative under a different name. It was no longer specifically about economics. It was about power. And everything to the postmodernists is about power. And that's actually why they're so dangerous, because if you're engaged in a discussion with someone who believes in nothing but power, all they are motivated to do is to accrue all the power to them, because what else is there?
Okay, so he says that everything for the postmodernists is about power and that they want to acquire power. Well, if we think about people like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, the only two names that Peterson will use when saying who the postmodern philosophers are, the acquisition of power was not a concern for them. To various extents, the analysis of the way that power functions and has functioned in society was important for them, but Derrida in particular, I mean, he talks about power, but his primary method, deconstruction, is not a method of gaining power. If anything, it's a method of undermining claims to consistent knowledge or problematizing sort of trends of acquiring knowledge in Western philosophy. If you look at Foucault's work, when he's doing these genealogical histories, he's not trying to figure out how to get power. He's looking at how power has been used and abused and modified throughout history. So it's kind of like saying that if I write a book about the history of sharks, that I would like to be a shark myself, right? I could write about sharks and not want to be a shark. Or, if I write Gilmore Girls fan fiction, I wish that I was actress Alexis Bledel. No, I'm just writing Gilmore Girls fan fiction. I don't want to be a Gilmore Girl. Basically that.
There's no discussion. There's no meeting of minds and consensus. There's power. And so since the 1970s, under the guise of postmodernism, we've seen the rapid expansion of identity politics throughout the universities. It's come to dominate all of the humanities, which are dead as far as I can tell, and a huge proportion of the social sciences. And we've been publicly funding extremely radical postmodern leftist thinkers who are hell-bent on demolishing the fundamental substructure of Western civilization. And that's no paranoid delusion. That's their self-admitted goal.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's different in Canada, but in my experiences of being a humanities academic, postmodernism was kind of out of fashion by the time I even started grad school. But maybe it came back around, like how kids are wearing baggy pants again.
And I've identified, not only me, obviously, but one of the main players in this entire drama is a French philosopher named Jacques Derrida, who I think most trenchantly formulated the anti-Western philosophy that is being pursued so assiduously by the radical left.
So this one's hard because I don't know what it means, first of all, to say that Derrida had this trenchant formation of an anti-Western philosophy. Now, Derrida was critical of elements of Western society the same way that any philosopher would be, because a part of doing philosophy is looking back historically on the tradition and critically modifying previous assumptions. So when Descartes, he of I think therefore I am fame, develops his form of rationalism, part of that involves criticizing previous assumptions about Western subjectivity, some of those which go back to Plato or Aristotle. Now, that doesn't make Descartes, this trenchant, violent, enemy of Western philosophy. It simply means that he's engaging with that tradition, right? He's re-articulating classical philosophical questions in his own era, which is a big part of what philosophy does. And Derrida's method, called deconstruction, aims for a type of internal critique. He's looking for sort of critique that is internal to texts themselves, but he's not someone who's just pointing his finger at Western society and saying, bad.
And I also don't think the degree to which it's already infiltrated our culture can be overstated. I mean, the people who hold this doctrine, this radical postmodern communitarian doctrine that makes racial identity or sexual identity or gender identity or some kind of group identity paramount, they've got control over most low to mid-level bureaucratic structures. And many governments as well, but even in the United States, where a lot of the governmental institutions have swung back to the Republican side, the postmodernist types have infiltrated bureaucratic organizations at the mid to upper level.
Okay, this seems pretty bonkers to me, because the argument would be that bureaucracies and governments in our world are being controlled by people who are followers of philosophers like Derrida and Foucault. And while that might be cool if it were the case, I don't see a lot of evidence of that. But if you do know who these deconstructionists and Foucauldians are that are running the government, please shout them out in the comments.
If you're dealing with systemic problems of poverty, for example, or trying to determine how to produce more opportunity for everyone to benefit from everyone's abilities, you have to use a hell of a lot more than compassion to get there. And so to think of community in the positive sense as being driven by nothing but empathy, which is really one of the central arguments of the postmodern types, at least that's what's driving some of their argumentation, is it's an absurd proposition. So it's not so much that they confuse the two things, is that they fail to differentiate the concepts to begin with. It's very, very difficult to build functional structures that help people thrive individually and socially over long periods of time.
Okay, so this idea that postmodern philosophers are driven by empathy, that it's absurd to be driven by empathy. First thing, you don't see a lot of discussion of empathy again in people like Derrida and Foucault. What I do think is interesting is Derrida has this notion of unconditional hospitality. And that doesn't just mean like unlimited breadsticks or something for him. It means that we let others in no matter what. We don't exclude. Everyone is a friend and not enemy, even when that becomes dangerous. Because of course, unconditional hospitality is dangerous. Imagine if you just like left your door open at all times of day and said, come on in. That would be dangerous, but this is a way of thinking about what real justice and real democracy looks like. So you could say that maybe that's driven by a type of empathy. I would struggle to see why that empathy is bad, but of course what Derrida is doing is thinking through kind of the problem or the paradox of justice, the paradox of unconditional hospitality, and getting us to think about that impossibility and what that means. So, but maybe empathy is bad. I don't know. Maybe I'm not gonna be empathetic anymore. I think that's what I'm gonna do now. I'm no longer gonna be empathetic.
Derrida described the West as male-dominated, which I think is something to take serious issue with as a blatant claim. It's not differentiated enough or sophisticated enough. And he also said it was logos-centric. And that partly means logic, but there's a deeper meaning to logos, because logos is also the second person of the Christian Trinity. And Derrida knew that perfectly well.
Okay, so here Peterson's playing a bit fast and loose. When he is talking about Derrida thinking that society is male-dominated, he's referring to his critique of phallogocentrism. And he brings up the logocentrism here. Logocentrism is a critique of a hierarchy of knowledge, like what we get in Plato, where ideas matter more than like representations of those ideas or images we see of them. Now, the phallocentrism part, this comes or starts from Freud. Freud thought that the literal biological penis played a role in the development of the unconscious. Now, Jacques Lacan, a French psychoanalytic theorist, a contemporary of Derrida's in Paris, critiqued Freud's literalization of the phallus, and instead he talks about the phallus as a signifier, not an actual biological penis. Right? So the phallus, and this is according to Adrian Johnston's reading of Lacan, has a structural function. It doesn't talk about the literal penis, and it's the structural function whatever a child hypothesizes the paternal figure possesses, making him the focus of the maternal figure's desire. Okay? So when we're talking about phallic desire, it's a desire for power, a desire to be the big other, a desire to be like God. So what is phallogocentrism then? Well, it's a critique of the dominance of a hierarchical form of knowledge in Western philosophy, and it's a critique of the idea or the structure of phallic desire in Western society, which doesn't mean desire for penises. It means a desire for a certain type of hierarchical power of the big other, the power of God, whatever it might be. So I think that's where Peterson misunderstands what's happening, and what leads him to then say that Derrida simply says like the West is male dominated. But also, I don't know, Google like how many presidents are men, or how many leaders of large corporations are men. Like, I mean, like, obviously that's not what Derrida was talking about, but it's like pretty true that most political leaders and business leaders are men. So there you go.
The logocentric idea is that his criticism of the idea of the logocentric society is a deep criticism of the idea that the individual as a speaking force, as a communicative force, is the appropriate highest value upon which a culture should be built. He took that apart and criticized it. And so that's a deeper criticism, I would say, even than Marx's criticism, which was mostly about unequal power relationships. Derrida went deeper than that. And the postmodernists that occupy the universities are anti-individual right down to the bedrock. And so that's partly why they push collectivism to such a degree. They don't give a damn who you are. They care what your group identity is. And that's that.
Okay, so what Peterson is talking about here is Derrida's critique of logocentrism. Now, he seems to think it's a critique of the speaking individual being, but again, it's not really a social critique, it's a philosophical critique. And the idea, again, is that logocentrism is a critique of hierarchical ways of thinking about knowledge, largely going back to Plato. So Derrida's not saying logic doesn't exist. He's not saying that truth doesn't exist. He's saying that the idea that language is the primary way that we access direct truth, and in particular that there is this absolute truth that we can access in this like mathematical way, is untrue, right? And we see that in Plato and Descartes and others. Okay, so there's so much going on in this video. I guess you can watch the whole thing yourself if you want. I wouldn't really recommend it. But I want to look at one last thing he says about postmodernism and philosophy and books.
Here's how you interpret a book if you're a postmodernist, like a fiction book. You don't read the book and try to understand what utility might be extracted out of it to guide you in your life. That's the old system. The new system is you read the book and you analyze it in terms of whose societal position of power it justifies. So you look for who the supremacist is in the text. It could be the author, it could be the characters, it doesn't matter. You read the text as if all it does is reflect on the current corrupt power structure that obtains in current society. And that's the beginnings of literary criticism under the social justice regime.
Okay, this is a weird one. At least in terms of philosophy, I think it's very weird to say that the point of reading a text philosophically is the extraction of utility to see how it can guide your life. Of course, there's works of moral philosophy that do just that. But when he says that postmodernists analyze books in terms of whose societal position of power it justifies or whatever, that's not really it. So Derrida did think that critique was internal to the text, that it's all in the text itself. But what deconstruction is a method of approaching a text to see how it self-deconstructs, to see where that sort of auto-deconstruction is operating, which means that when I approach a text, I'm reading it against itself. What I'm not doing is taking an external intellectual framework and laying it over the text and using that to analyze, which seems to be what Peterson is saying here. Instead, I'm analyzing the text on its own terms, but kind of looking for those spaces, those inconsistencies, those paradoxes in the text itself. It's a very difficult way of approaching text, and I would never say it's not, but what Peterson is saying here is super reductive to Derridian deconstruction and how it's applied to literary theory. Okay, I want to look a little bit at this lecture that Peterson gave called Identity Politics and the Marxist Lie of White Privilege. And again, I think to get ready for this video, I watched 30 or 40 hours of Peterson, and it's been hard to narrow it down. So I want to jump around here a little bit and really look at some of the stuff he says about postmodernism and postmodern philosophy. Again, just a reminder, the only names that I have seen him use when he talks about who the postmodern philosophers are Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. So if you hear me talking about them, it's because he did it first.
And so the world they envision, as far as I can tell, is something like it's a sociologically Hobbesian nightmare. So Hobbes thought of, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes thought of the natural state of human beings as every individual in some sense at the throat of every other individual. So that the basic state of mankind, unlike the Rousseauian state of, say, virgin innocence and the primitive Garden of Paradise, was an all-out war of everyone against everyone else, and that required the imposition of a social order to keep peace, essentially. So it's a fairly dark view of humankind. Rousseau, on the other hand, would think of people as intrinsically good and the social order as intrinsically tyrannical. You can actually think about Hobbes and Rousseau in some sense as opposites that need to be paired together in order to get a relatively comprehensive view of human nature. Well, the postmodern view is like the Hobbesian view in some sense, except you want to replace the individual with pyramids of social organization, so hierarchies of social organization that are based on group identity. And that the landscape in which those pyramids exist is one of unbroken enmity and inability to communicate. So it's a very dark view as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's fundamentally wrong.
Okay, so the claim here is that postmodern philosophers want to replace the category of the individual. And we'll start there just by saying, no, they want to criticize the structure of individual subjectivity in Western philosophy and rethink how it interacts with systems of power, and then replace it with social hierarchies founded on identities.
The head joker at the top of the postmodern hierarchy as Derrida. Foucault is often mentioned, as are a number of other people. Here's some other attributes of postmodern thinking. There's a recognition of the existence of hierarchy, that's for sure. And there's an echo of that idea, the recognition of hierarchy, in the term patriarchy, because of course patriarchy is a recognition of hierarchy. Now it's a very particular kind of recognition, but the postmodernists also tend to define hierarchy as a consequence of power differential.
But the notion of social hierarchies is not primary for Derrida or Foucault in any prescriptive sense. Now, Derrida is interested in democracy and its impossibility, but democracy nonetheless. And Foucault isn't really interested in top-down hierarchical power. He's interested in the way in which power functions at the term of networks, right? So when Foucault does analysis of how power works in society, it's a microphysics of power. He wants to look at the way power is structured in the everyday. So for Foucault, it's more about a bottom-up analysis and not a top-down analysis to see how subjects are constituted by these networks of power. Again, it's not saying that the individual subject doesn't exist, but that they are constituted by networks of power. But in neither case do we see Derrida or Foucault saying we need to get rid of individuals and replace them with hierarchical networks of power founded on identities. It's just not in the text.
The hierarchies in functioning Western democracies are fundamentally predicated on power and tyranny. And then, I can use a biological example too, which would place me outside of the postmodern realm of argument, because the postmodernists don't believe in biology, but they act like they do because they all die. So
okay, this is a real wild claim, right? I don't know what it means to say that they don't believe that biology exists. Here's what I know. I'll give you some facts. Derrida was interested enough to do an entire seminar on biology. It was called Le Vie, Le Mort. He interacted with molecular biology and genetics via the work of a biologist named Francois Jacob. So he believed in biology enough to dedicate a seminar to it. Foucault has this notion of biopower. We talked about it in the Boys video recently, which presupposes that biology exists, and not only does it exist, Foucault thinks it's an utterly important category when we think about modern society. So for Foucault, biopower describes the regulation and control of human life and populations. He called it the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, of a general strategy of power, or in other words, how starting from the 18th century, modern Western societies took on board the fundamental biological fact that human beings are a species. So, again, it was a silly comment for him to make, but it seems irresponsible to me if you're going to level critiques against an intellectual tradition, and then if you were going to identify two people as your primary targets in a critique of a tradition, to not have a cursory knowledge of their work is very frustrating, and it makes it really hard to really interact with this other than just saying like, no, you're wrong, because he's saying things that are so out of pocket. But let's see what else he says.
So, so much for the idea that power is the only game in town. Then you got to ask the question is, well, this is actually a postmodern question. So, one of the things Derrida said, the main postmodern joker, is that by categorizing, you privilege one concept and you force other concepts out to the margins. And so he believed that when you constructed a hierarchy of power, the hierarchy of power privileged certain people and marginalized others.
Okay, I find this really confusing because Peterson implies that hierarchies don't fundamentally privilege some things over other things. One definition of hierarchy is an arrangement of items, objects, names, values, categories that are represented as being above, below, or at the same level as one another. So, like in terms of things being above or below, I don't see how that doesn't involve privileging. Like if I say, that as a fruit, a blueberry is above an apple, I'm hierarchically privileging a blueberry over an apple. I do think that too. I don't like apples. They're really mealy. And every time I try to, like once a year, I'm like, I'm gonna eat an apple again. And it's so mealy. But the hierarchies that Derrida talks about, again, refer back to that critique of logocentrism. And the idea that speech is hierarchically opposed to writing. That presence is hierarchically opposed to representation. And again, this is more to do with the critique of Plato's idealism and its legacy in philosophy than it is with Derrida critiquing some contemporary social hierarchy. And I think that confusion is at play here. And of course, the implication for Peterson is that Derrida wants to push others out, that marginalization is good, but Derrida is all about democracy. We talked about this before. He's all about unconditional hospitality. Now, he does think democracy is paradoxically tied up with sovereign power, and that there is a paradox implied in how democracy functions, but this democracy to come that he speaks of is still something that should push us towards the future, and I think that it's fair to say Derrida is a fundamentally democratic thinker. Would love to break it down more, but it's complicated, so go read some Derrida if you want. It can be fun. It's frustrating, but it's fun.
You have to ask why it is that you would, if you were a postmodernist yourself, why it is that you would privilege the idea of power above all else. It's exactly what is it that you're pushing to the margin. And so that's something that we're going to talk about. Now, here's one thing you might push to the margin. Let's say that you believe that hierarchies are a consequence of power. Well, then you push competence to the margin. And then applying the postmodernist logic, you might say, well, the reason you're privileging power is so that you could push competence to the margin.
Okay, so when he says again that Derrida wants power above all else, he wants to push people to the margins, I don't see how that works with Derrida's categories of unconditional hospitality and radical friendship. This is a quote. This is from Derrida's book of Hospitality. He says, absolute hospitality requires that I open up my home and that I give not only to the foreigner, but to the absolute unknown anonymous other. So that's what Derrida says. Okay, that's enough Jordan Peterson for one day. So thank you so much for sticking with me through that. And again, if you have any questions or want further explanation of anything we got into, please drop those in the comments below. I mean it. Drop them. I'll try to respond to them. Okay, so what did we learn today? Well, I think at least two things. One is that both Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault wanted to push philosophy beyond a traditional Platonist or metaphysical paradigm in a search for more just and democratic forms of thought. And two, whatever Peterson thinks postmodernism is, he's absolutely not talking about Derrida, Foucault, and their influence. Or at least that's what he thinks he's doing. Instead, he seems to be using postmodernism as a straw man that gives him a type of lefty intellectual boogeyman to fight against. And while it might seem easy to simply dismiss this as a cynical and willful misreading of a couple of philosophers, the reality might be more harmful. Because like it or not, Jordan Peterson is a wildly influential public intellectual who many people, and especially young dudes on the internet, take as an authority figure on subjects like psychology, ethics, and philosophy. And when public intellectuals, whose job it is to convey complicated ideas in understandable and relatable terms, abuse the trust the public puts in them, the effects can be bad. Like, really bad. So, this stuff matters. But what do you all think? Like I said before, let us know in the comments. And as always, if there's any other thinker or movie or TV show you think warrants a philosophical reaction, please let us know. A huge thanks to all our patrons for your support. And do check out our Patreon page if you haven't in a while. We have some great stuff going on there, and the support means a lot to us. Like this video if you liked it, or if you just want to support the work I did in watching all that Jordan Peterson. It'd mean a lot. And thanks as always for watching. It means so much to us. I'll catch you later.